So that's my answer to your question.
We're running out of time. We'll take 3 questions and we together.
Yeah.
First Kamul, then you start learning.
Thank you for your talk. Are there any opposition of this artificial construction? I heard there are some opposition within the scholars and pundits. They try to reverse the situation, or they created literature against this artificial construction. Are there any examples, or are there any opposition of this artificial construction?
Do you want me to take all the questions?
This lady.
You talked about the syncretic tradition of Bengali in the 18th century, and then how it got split along class lines and religious lines. And I appreciate your research stops in 1905, around that period, and this lady over here spoke about somebody whose research stops in the 1930s. But I was wondering, given that Bangladesh was founded in the 1970s on specifically secular lines, whether there was any research that looked at how that's affected the language.
I think that's where the earlier speaker can come in, who's worked on this. What was her name? Nazneen, was it?
Yeah,
she's worked on. She can perhaps tell you more about that. This is specifically what this is what I just know from the way she's described on your program. She's perhaps not here. You are. Maybe you can respond to that later on.
Later, yeah.
I can talk to you in the break.
But her work is very specifically related to your question.
I think we just go to this lady.
Thank you for your fascinating talk. I'm so sorry I arrived late, it was unavoidable. But I wonder if you touched on Rabindranath Tagore, and I'm particularly interested in his Sanskritized Gitanjali. And one thing that intrigues me, I've got here a copy of his original manuscript in his own handwriting. It's in Bangla and in English. And one thing that intrigues me is his own self-censoring on what is probably the only political verse in Gitanjali, where the mind is without fear. And bearing in mind that the verse was written in 1900, and he translated it in 1912, so Bengal was partitioned by the British in 1905, after ructions unpartitioned in 1911. So when he came to London in 1912, the invitation of William Robinstein, he wasn't sure what to bring of his work, so he brought some of his poems, translated them on the way. And so his original translation of this verse was, where the mind is, I'll just read out the first sentence, where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been partitioned by narrow domestic walls. Now, he has in his own handwriting crossed out the word partitioned, which is very, very interesting because he wanted to sell the concept of his poetry to Britain in 1912. And he's altered it, the word partitioned, to the world has not been frittered into fragments. Now, Yeats fine-tuned...
Sorry, the word has not been...
the world has not been frittered into fragments.
Okay. Right.
But that was slightly fine-tuned in the English publication because Yeats fine-tuned it and arranged the publication. He selected 103 of the verses. So Yeats fine-tuned that to has not been broken into fragments. But very interesting that in Tagore's own handwriting, I don't know whether his son Rathi might have said, oh look Dad, this is too sensitive, whether it might have been Yeats, because he was a very anglicised Irishman, whether it was Tagore himself. So it's intriguing what actually drove him to cross that out and amend it.
Can I take this question first and then I'll come back to you? I think you're absolutely right. It's possibly because he found the word very politically sensitive for the period, because it was coming in 1912 and the partition had been annulled in 1911. So I would imagine, I don't know whether this was somebody like his son advising him or whether he had done it himself. But it's interesting to see, I mean, that itself is quite interesting for us to see how particular choice of words is very much shaped by contemporary politics. And we have to be aware of that because we kind of take literary texts for granted and languages for granted, but to actually look at what all went on into the shaping of these literary texts and languages it becomes very important for us. I did not talk about Tagore because I think, and this is a question I think that has been asked of me earlier when I talked to people about Bengali language as to why I don't talk about Tagore. But that's because Tagore requires he needs to be looked at in his entirety and on his own. times. He's such a colossal figure.
Yeah.
But Tagore's works, of course, also are very central to this whole process that I'm talking about, which is about, particularly around the time that he's writing at the turn of, the start of the 20th century, end of 19th, start of the 20th century. This is when romantic nostalgia is feeding the literature of the period. This is a time that the folk elements of Bengali literature come back into Bengali, and this is being celebrated. This is something that Bengalis should be proud of. Tagore is part of this tradition, even though, of course, he is, he's not somebody that one would talk about in the same breath as Bhakta, of course, but this is a very selective bringing back of certain strands within mainstream Bengali in order to give it the authenticity, in order to give it the strength to fight the colonial critique. And it's, other scholars have shown how, literary scholars as well, how actually within this newly formed language in the early 20th century, there is a lot of scope for a critique of the colonial state and of westernization in particular, which is done through the language of the ordinary people. So the colloquial becomes the vehicle for anti-colonial critique. Because the Bhadralok's refined language can't do it anymore, because it's seen as fake, it's seen as inauthentic, because the Bhadralok is reliant on the colonial state for power. Sorry, I've gone off into political history again. But to come back to literary writings of the period, this is why Tagore is very important for us, because as we know, he also experiments with language in such a fashion as to make these folk elements very important for us. So from that point of view, he's extremely important, absolutely. To go back to your question, there isn't any opposition that, I don't think I talked about any opposition in those terms, but I talked about the Bhattala press, which invested in completely different form of Bengali, which wasn't bothered with mainstream standardized Bengali at all. And and what I'm arguing is this press mattered and its publications mattered because of its sheer volume. Because in terms of numbers, it is much more representative of the people than the Bhadralok press. And one wouldn't have thought of this before, because we wouldn't take it seriously. We would just sideline this or marginalize this literature, saying it wasn't worthy of study. But it is worthy of study because it helps us understand the social history of the period and the representative politics of these various groups who are reading this literature for the period. So this is to say that print doesn't just standardize, but print also opens up the possibilities of larger groups of people, because these presses were very cheap. With very little money, you could just set up a press in Bhattala and you could print thousands and become rich overnight. And I've found accounts of shopkeepers having second-story houses. Can you imagine? In the mid-19th century, 1860s, 1870s. So they must have done very well to be able to build big houses like that. So these are printer entrepreneurs who know that they have a social role to play. Apart from the fact, of course, they're also capitalizing on the market, because there is such a big market for these works.
Thank you very much. I hope you found it stimulating and interesting. We're going to have a short break, but don't go, because we got our two best presentation yet left, right? So have a 10 minutes break, and then you can buy some tea, coffee there, have some water or whatever. See you in 10 minutes time.